and welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. Last week, we had a recorded program on optimism bias. And today, we're going to, in a sense, follow up with that by taking a look at how economists and the financial industry view climate change. So, if you listen to this channel or any other climate channel, or just follow the news on climate change, you'll know that um, things are very serious. The warming is accelerating, impacts are accelerating, tipping points are on the horizon, and you might be quite alarmed, as I think you should be. However, you might wonder, well, wait a second, if I know all of this and everybody else can know this too, nothing secret about it, why isn't the world in general concerned? Why isn't there more action taking place? Why isn't, for example, the financial industry being cautious with its investments in property in Miami, let's say, or whatever, and taking into account the dangers that we're quite aware of? Well, it turns out that they don't, as probably not surprising. But the reason they don't is actually quite interesting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And to do that, I have a presentation. So let's switch to that. And let's make the presentation big. Here we go. And it's on the science and versus economics when it comes to climate change. And originally, I was going to do this on two related reports. One is called Loading the Dice Against Pension Funds, which directly looks at, as we'll see, how economists look and financial advisors look at climate change. But sort of a newer report that references the Loading the Dice report, Parasol Loss Recovery Plan Needed. And this is from that one from the University of Exeter, Faculty of Actuaries. Again, actuaries are people who look at risk, like for an insurance company, for example. And so that's what they do. They look at risk, something that we haven't done well with climate change. So they've been focused a number of reports. We've done a show previously about another report they did about the risks of climate change. But as you'll see, when I go through the DICE report, that kind of fills up the time. So we're not going to really reference too much of the Parasol Loss report today. But let's jump into it. And before I do, of course, I want to remind you to subscribe and to like the video, because it's important, as you'll see today, that this information gets out to the broader public, including economists and financial people as well, and policymakers. And the best way to do that you can help is by subscribing, liking, and suggesting this video to other people. So let's go here again. So again, as I mentioned, this is a report called Loading the Dice. And just for reference, DICE stands for Dynamic Integrated Model of Climate and the Economy. And so it's a model where you put in parameters and you get out like what's called a damage function, like how much will GDP is usually what they're looking at, how much GDP will be harmed in the future due to climate change. And so let's get back to the presentation here. And this is put out by Carbon Tracker, and it's actually from July 2023. So it's a year and a half old or so, like that. So what are the main, first I'm going to just go through the main points, and then we'll go through a little more detail on what this report is all about. So the first main point is that economic advice regarding climate change comes from economists, and it's usually just reviewed by other economists. It's not reviewed, for the most part, by climate scientists. And that's sort of how they can get in their own bubble and come up with, as you'll see, amazingly absurd results. And you might guess it's not in line with climate science. For example, and we'll get into more of these, economists warn that 2 to 4.3 C of would warming have minimal, excuse me, minimal economic impact, and 6C would reduce GDP by 10%. Well, 6C is beyond the end of civilization. 252 million years ago, the Earth warmed 6 to 8 C, and 90% of all life on Earth perished. It was the greatest mass extinction. So I think they're a little bit off on that one. And so there's this huge disconnect between what climate scientists say and what economists, investors, wealth advisor, financial institutions, regulators say about climate change. So, given that they're so out of step with what's actually happening, it's inevitable that, as they put it, a wealth damaging correction is virtually inevitable. The question is when. Of course, that's still an open question. Um, Now, it's interesting because very often in these situations, wealth advisors, people who manage pension funds, they have what's called a fiduciary duty. In other words, they're sort of obligated to do what's best for the owners of these pension funds. Um, and and so far they're not, because they're giving advice based on incorrect information. So they actually have a duty to correct that. Of course, they're not really aware that they need to correct that. So that's partially why this report was written. And, rather than just treating it as well, it'll have a little effect sometime in the future. Um, I think climate change has to be treated as potentially an existential threat. That's what the report says, and I agree. So, so let's take a look at some of this a little more detailed. Now, this is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you would think, well, this is a scientific body who's totally aware of climate change, so they'll have the right information. But of course, when it comes to economics, they don't really know. They're climate scientists, not economists. So they did a literature search on what the economic impact of climate change would be, and published that the warming of 4C may cause a 10 to 23%. It's hard not to laugh when you read these things. Cause a 10 to 23% decline in annual global GDP by 2100 relative to what the GDP would have been without global warming. And again, 4C, as Kevin Anderson put it on this program, is beyond, let's see, how did he put it? 4C is not compatible with an organized global community, is one way to put it. So this is absurd, really. And you got to remember, what they mean by this is not 10 to 23% less GDP than today, but 10 to 23% less than what it would have been. And based on their projections, that's 13 to 15 times larger GDP than we have today. And then you take off, 10 to 23%. So it's pretty crazy. And as we know, talking on this program, getting to 3 degrees is catastrophic. So to say that there's only not even a decrease in GDP, but a slowdown in the increase of GDP is the only thing that's going to happen from 4 degrees of warming is crazy. And one thing they talk about in this report, which I didn't put in the slides, but they say one of the ways to check all of this is to do the smell test. You say, does this make any sense at all? You're supposed to ask that question, something that they haven't done, obviously, but this doesn't pass the smell test. So let's take a look at some others. So this is like an example. They give a whole bunch of examples in the report, and you could look. Oh, links to the report. Both reports actually are in the show notes here. So just go to the YouTube video description, and you can get links to the reports. But here's an example from a county pension fund in the UK. Excuse me. And they have an annualized climate impact on portfolio returns 2030 and 2050. So they say in the 2-degree scenario, warming scenario, that by 2030, that will actually help their portfolios by 0.05%. And by 2050, it'll have a negative impact of minus 0.06%. Now, if you get up to 3C, it does hurt in 2030 by 0.01%. And by 2050, 0.05%. Kind of interesting that it's less impact than the 2C case in 2050. And then in 4C, again, end of civilization times, uh, 2030 as a minus 0.6% impact in 2030 and a minus zero point 0.1. Now we're really getting up into it there. A minus 0.1% impact in 2050. So if you just imagine you knew about climate change and you see these things, and the fact that that these pension managers have access to climate chat, to the IPCC, to everybody, and yet they're inside this bubble where it's actually a small number of economists that we're going to talk about one of them in a moment, but a small number of economists that write this stuff, and they're all sort of feeding back on each other and reinforcing what they do. They don't have climate scientists come in and say how absurd all of this is. And then the pension fund. This sounds great for the pension funds, right? If you're a pension fund manager, you go, well, this is great. I'm going to include this information in my report. But it's crazy. So this is sort of number one guy. William Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for coming up with his DICE model that showed 3.5 to 4C was optimal warming. What does that mean? Well, the idea is that global warming will have a negative impact on the economy, but also addressing global warming will have a cost. You have to switch over to renewables, or maybe you have to take CO2 out of there, whatever you have to do, there's a cost involved. And so you want to balance the two. For the optimum economics, you want the cost just to equal, the damage to equal the cost of addressing it. And he came up with his model that balance point was 3.5 to 4C. Again, 4C is not compatible with an organized global community, which means collapse of civilization. And he got a Nobel Prize for saying that the collapse of civilization was the optimal point. And a little more detail in there. He had 2% loss of GDP in 2100 at 3 degrees C, and 8% at 6C. And how could you do this? How can you have a model that shows that? Well, they did things like, 87% of work is indoors, so that won't be impacted by climate change. So just stop and think about that for a moment. Of course, if I was teaching a class and he turned this in, I would fail him, but instead he got a Nobel Prize. So let's look at it a little bit more. So this is his model. And what it has here on this, on the y-axis, is damage as percent of output. So basically reduction of GDP. And so it goes from 0 to 5%. And on the bottom is the global mean increased temperature. So basically at 1 degree, the damage is less than 1%. At 2, it's approaching 1%, not quite there. 3, it's approaching 2%. And then when you get around 5, you're up to 5% damage. This is degrees Celsius increase. Again, 5, mass extinction, whatever, tipping points. We'll talk about tipping points in a moment. And then the IPCC adopted this range here. So crazy stuff. So in the report, they come up with what they think is a more reasonable approach, using different kinds of functions, because if you fit the curve to the current data, which is GDP impact from about a third of a degree warming to 1 degree, that's all they have so far, all the curves fit no matter what you do. So you have to know what's going to happen beyond the current data as we warm. And if you use an exponential fit, you get to 100% GDP destruction at about 3.3 degrees of warming. But of course, it will then go beyond 100% quite quickly, and you can't have beyond 100%. So it doesn't naturally fit data, but there's something called a logistic curve, which is an S-shaped curve, which follows things like adoption rates for technologies, lots of other things, where it maximizes at 100%. And it's, again, an S curve. And if you use that function, you hit 100% of GDP destruction at around 5C. And, between those two, that's probably a reasonable thing. If you use a quadratic fit, then of course, which is I think what they typically do in the economic models, it shows very little impact all the way up to 6 degrees, so less than 20%. So um, let's keep going here. So that's what the economists say. What do the climate scientists say? Well, here's a quote they have in their report from Stefan et al. In 2018. The risk that a 2C warming could activate important tipping elements, raising the temperature further to activate other tipping elements in a domino like cascade that could take the Earth system to even higher temperatures, tipping cascades, conditions that would be hospitable, to current human societies. So, yeah, that's where we're at. And the economists are not following that. And this, again, I think it's really important. We can keep talking about we're gonna have more climate scientists telling us what's happening, how bad things are. But if the world doesn't react to that, like what good is that information? And this is telling us where a big part of the world, how it's reacting to climate change. It's essentially ignoring it. It's not being informed of the true dangers. And it has a small group of people who are saying that the climate impacts will be very small. So just continue doing what you're doing, continuing investing like you're investing in fossil fuels, for example. It goes, don't worry, it has very little impact in the future. And and again, this is not just, there's one thing to say if you do a discount rate, maybe there's great harm in the future, like 100 years from now, you could destroy the earth, but as you work back the numbers, it has a very small impact today because you've highly discounted that future damage. That's not what this is saying. This is saying that in the future, the damage will be very small. And it's just, of course, just wrong. But since it's just economists reviewing other economists, and they're all sort of agreeing on the general method of your dice model, uh, they just keep doing what they're doing. And of course, we talk a lot about tipping points on this program. And these, for the most part, these financial models don't account for tipping points. Or if they do, they say, well, a tipping point can just be translated into a slightly higher temperature. We can treat it as a slightly higher temperature and then take a look at the damage from that. Of course, the damage is tiny from all these incredibly high temperatures. 5-6 degrees is still pretty minor. So a tipping point gets translated into a minor inconvenience as well. And I'm putting this slide up because this is a slide I included in my 2008 climate talks, talking about black swans. A black swan is an unexpected event, and you think they're rare, but it turns out that everything in your life is created by black swans. Black swans are sort of 9/11, the introduction of the iPhone. You can go on and on. Invasion of Ukraine or something. Things that you didn't expect, but the whole world is filled with the impacts from these quote rare things that end up happening. And this is the idea is that a turkey is getting, is born and then it's fed every day. It might be a little nervous about the farmer, but every day the farmer comes out and gives them some more feed. And over time, the turkey's confidence increases until around November, when all of a sudden there's a black swan event for the turkey, kind of mixing metaphors here. But and then the confidence goes to zero when it's served for Thanksgiving dinner. And these kind of impacts are not considered in the financial community at all, even though some black swans are more likely than others, even if you don't know exactly when they're going to happen. When it comes to climate change, we're going to have, as I say, a flock of black swans. So I just thought I'd throw that in from back in the good old days of 2008. And in the report, they had this quote from John Maynard Keynes, and I thought it was appropriate because you kind of wonder, well, don't worry, reality is going to catch up with these economists and financial people, and then they're going to see the light because climate damage is going to increase much faster than they're assuming. And then, as he said long ago, markets can remain irrational for longer than you can remain solvent. So it doesn't gives you a little pause when it comes to that. There was another quote that I really liked, and this is from the Powerful Loss report, and that is that policymakers and other actors may not have understood either the proximity or severity of climate risk, seeing a distant speed bump rather than a child running into the road. I thought that was a really good way of putting it. And with that, I had a very short presentation, but I think it gave the point, and by the way, obviously like and subscribe, but it gave the point that, you kind of wonder when you focus on climate change science like we do here, and you wonder, well, wait a second, why am I upset about this? Why am I concerned about this? And everyone else seems to be going along happily and not really very worried about this, especially those whose job it is to take a look into the future and, take a look at what economic conditions are going to be in the future. And they must, they have to factor this in. Well, it turns out they don't have to factor it in. Well, they should factor it in, but they don't. And these models are still being used today, that have these crazily low damage functions in them. And it's not going to go well for anybody because of that. So I'm going to bring Leon in now. Hold on a second here. And let's go. Oops, sorry, Leon. What happened? Did you maybe click? Oh, I see what's going on. Let me do it. There we go. Okay, you do it.
Okay.
Ping ponging. All right. That's what happened.
Hi there.
The control, and they're both hitting it at the same time. So, Leon, your thoughts on how financial advisors and economists are viewing climate change?
Yeah, I think there's some reporting and there's some academic work being done on that, but as you experience yourself, and I think more and more people are starting to experience in the real world, insurance companies, they don't really care about academic models. They care about the real world, right? And about real world risks. And when they start to learn that insuring homes in areas that are very prone to hurricanes or very prone to wildfires or other weather extremes, they have to increase the premiums, or they even move out of these regions. They stop insuring homes in these regions. And I think that's really the start where we can see that the theory doesn't really live up to the practice.
Right.
And I think what's next is that you won't get any financing to buy houses in regions where you cannot insure homes, right? Because if a bank would need to finance your house, of course they also ask you to insure that house even while you're still building it. So I think step by step the financial reality is catching up with the reality of increasing extreme climate events.
Right.
And in a way, I think the academic world is by definition quite slow to catch up. As we've seen the past 6 years, right? We've been warning about the acceleration even before 2020, and then NASA and NOAA published data showing the heat uptake, global heat uptake, had doubled in 2021, and only now, 6 years later, you see the general scientific community accepting the fact that the rate of warming has significantly increased and will now start to show also in surface air temperature, but also in more extreme weather happening much faster than most of them modeled in the previous 20 years. And yeah, of course, it takes some effort for them, for many people who want, like many of them are scientists, academics. They are used to being right. They teach their students that, and they are used to be taken serious. And once the data proves them wrong, it's often a hard pill to swallow. But in the real world, like those of us who have to live with the impacts, we better pay attention to the real world and start to act like it.
Yeah, now there's a few points you made there. Like one is about insurance companies. So insurance companies are among the only financial institutions that are taking climate change seriously because their existence depends on getting it right and getting it right now. Because there is some data on that in the report, how damage is, I forget what the numbers are exactly, but they've gone up greatly in just the last, 10, 20 years. And also, I'll just take it personally. So I'm someone who's been giving talks on climate change for 20 years, right? So already, just me personally, I've lost a vacation place in Napa Valley, which is north of San Francisco here, to a climate fire, clearly a climate fire that during that we had some crazy summers here of high fire danger. And you don't normally have fires in Napa Valley, but this one ripped through and burned the whole place down. That's number one. And number two is I live in what's, I guess, the wildland interface. There's a bunch of trees nearby and some sort of undeveloped land nearby. And I've lost my commercial insurance on my home and had to sign up with the state insurance. Now, the state can only do that for so long. I read once that so California has this state insurance and Florida has the state insurance in case you can't get commercial insurance. But I read once that there was a hurricane, I don't remember which one, that came through Florida. And if all the homes damaged were signed up for the Florida state insurance, the payout would have been more than the entire state budget of Florida, not the insurance budget, the entire state budget of Florida. So you can see how this stuff, states can step in at the early days of these problems and fill in the gaps. But after a while, this problem gets too big and they can't handle it. It's not really clear how insurance is going to handle, or
and that was just
how the financial community will handle it. Yeah.
It was the roll of the dice that it didn't happen.
Well, not everyone signed up. It was a little bit of a hypothetical because not everyone, first of all, a lot of people are not covered by insurance, right? So there's a lot of uninsured losses whenever one of these hurricanes happen. And then some of the people still were on commercial insurance and some were on the state insurance. But if everybody was on the state insurance, then it would have been overwhelming. And that's where we're going too, right?
In the end, of course, if the insurance company cannot foot the bill because the hurricane goes through a region which has too many expensive houses, right? Which are all destroyed by this Category 5 or 6 hurricane, then that happening is just the roll of the dice away, right? It will happen at a certain time. Now that the oceans are heating much faster than they have ever heated in the known history of our planet, they are bound to, and the tropical oceans are now warmer than they have been in at least more than 120,000 years. So that means more than 200,000 years, and maybe even 800,000 years. Because like the proxies we have show that the sea surface temperatures are now higher than they have been in in the fossil record of these seashells, right? And they for sure will be in the next decades. So we'll have these enormous hurricanes, which no one is preparing for, I think. And so the only way
Storms
you
of our
really can,
grandchildren, as James Hansen put it on the title of his book.
yeah, and it's right. It is grandchildren, but like I'm young enough to have to be his grandchild, right? So age wise, so it's our generations, the millennials,
Right.
the millennials who will face this, and let alone our children. Our children like will most certainly, based on the data, experience a 3-degree world, and you saw now also this report from the United Kingdom security agency, the MI5 and MI6. It was like gate kept by the government because it was not positive enough, right? So they are gatekeeping crucial information from their citizens,
Of course.
because it's not optimistic enough, right? This like toxic anti-doomer narrative, which has spread like a climate-induced wildfire, right? Where we cannot talk about bad things happening. It's like it's really crazy. Like in every other industry, whether it's airlines or it's security or terrorism, right? If you keep these crucial information from the public, right, you will be impeached. And now it's just like half the population doesn't want to believe it, and the other half's like, hey, maybe it is not that bad. And
well, look at the U.S. where we're like shutting down, where we're erasing climate for climate data that was already there on the websites of Weather Service or other places, and of course just purely denying climate change. So you can kind of see how the financial community might feel vindicated. Oh, well, the president says it's all a hoax, so we can just go on and say it's not going to have a big impact. It's pretty crazy. Let's bring Eli in for a comment. Hey, Eli, welcome.
Hey, thanks. I mean, this is everybody knows this, but it bears mentioning that what all of these decision makers, except for the insurance industry, are responding to are, the next quarterly financial reports, the next annual review, the next election, and everything that comes after that, they'll worry about later. And systemically, like, the incentives are all wrong, and anybody who does talk about what will this mean for our kids, what will this mean for our grandkids, well, they won't do as well on the next quarterly numbers if they really like do anything about this, or their next annual review, or the next election is an open question because people are becoming more aware as it's becoming harder and harder to deny it. But the disinfo machine is really working, firing on all cylinders. And I think the question is, beyond doing what we're doing, how do we really shift this narrative?
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that, because what this report is saying, first of all, you're right. Certainly when it comes to a CEO, I mean, they're rewarded basically on their quarterly performance. But these are financial advisors that are looking into the future, right? And they're saying this is what we think is going to happen in 2100. So they're looking far into the future. And yet they're coming up with bullshit numbers. And again, they're relying on, but this economist said it. It's in a model, it's in a model. They trust models when it's this kind of model. And yet it's garbage in, garbage out. I mean, I gave you an example what Nordhaus said. Well, 87% of work is indoors, and that won't be impacted by climate change, which is a crazy thing to say. But you know, it's an assumption. He stated his assumptions. He put it in a model. He got a Nobel Prize. So you know, it's pretty crazy. It is pretty crazy. Let's bring Stacy in. Let's see. Hey, Stacy.
Hi, how are you
Hi.
guys?
Maybe we should go to this way so we can do the cats. We need to bring the cats in. There we go.
Yes, yes. And
What's wrong with
Rocky's in the
cats
back
tonight?
here.
What's going on?
So Rocky has had some hot spots and it's like little itchy things and they itch, so he scratches and then they get worse.
There we
So this is the kinder, gentler cone of shame. So it's like a little pillow, so that because the regular one, he was just like, wow,
Oh yeah,
and he
right. The
squirms out of
cone,
it.
the cone of shame.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, so he is. I got this one on that site, and it's much better. It's much more tolerated, and so he's almost done, and he's so
Okay.
much better. Yeah.
Okay,
So
we
that's
wish him a
Rocky.
speedy recovery. So what are
Thank
your
you.
thoughts on how the financial institutions view
Oh,
the future
so
of
many.
climate
So
change?
I was a business major, so this is like part of my old world, and you were saying about economists not consulting climate scientists and being in their own bubble. And I'm thinking about the economists that would say, oh, yeah, well, the climate scientists don't consult with us when they're thinking about climate change and how it's going to affect the economy, because it's so inconvenient. And they view themselves as scientists, rather than, necessarily social scientists. And it's like, there aren't the hard and fast rules in the economy that there are in the physical world. So, and you mentioned the 2018 report on cascading damages, increasing tipping points, et cetera. Did you do that because 2018 is when Nordhaus won his Nobel?
Well, no, I put that in 2018 because that's when he got it. But that, by the way, this is not like a long time ago before we really knew what was going on in climate change. I mean, we knew then, 2018, we knew, of course, how dangerous climate change was, how possibly destructive it would be. And yet, I should point out, by the way, that the Nobel Prize in economics is not really a Nobel Prize.
Oh, what is it?
They licensed, a bank licensed the Nobel Prize name to do a Nobel Prize in economics. It's like an interesting little story about that. Oh, sorry.
That's awkward because they're, oh my goodness.
I mean, it is a Nobel Prize in that it has the name Nobel Prize in it, but it was added later, and it was not by the same committee, and I don't remember exactly why they gave in to the pressure, but they did. Or the money. I think they gave it to the money.
I mean, Trump University called itself a university,
Right.
So the one thing, oh my gosh, Rocky, you're funny. I guess the thing I keep thinking, question, has Nordhaus walked any of this back since then? Like, has he learned it all, or is he still sticking to his guns?
I'm not sure, but I don't think he's really walked it back.
Softened?
He's done in the report. I think by the way, he's done some more work on this, where he's taken like all of the estimates and put them together, but all of the estimates are based kind of like on what he did, in a way, right? There's only a very small group. They go through this. How many people are actually, how many authors of all these papers? And it's a very small number. And there's like two groups, including his group and another group. And then there's like all together, maybe 80, 90 authors all together, but they're not even the prime authors. So when you look at it, it's still a very closed community. And no, they haven't walked it back. As far as, I mean, maybe a little bit, but not like saying, oh, sorry, we were all wrong.
It's really, it's actually, it does feel very Don't Look Up. Like, are you kidding me? Like, you really think that it's, that this is when we'll feel X, or like we can make it to 6 degrees or whatever.
But it is, I thought this was appropriate program to do this week because following optimism bias. So it's In a
Yeah.
sense, this is all optimism bias. Like, let's take a look at what the impacts will be, and let's look at, okay, what will be the impacts of climate change? Well, let's see, most work's indoors, that won't be impacted. Look, you just go, you can kind of fool yourself into this, yeah, but what happens when you don't have food? You don't have water? What happens then? What happens when, there's sea level rise and all your cities are gone? I mean, you got to really kind of leave out the bad parts in order to come up with these models. I mean,
Well, this is what I mean. I say often is this is all bad for business. I mean, and I think if it makes me wonder if any of it is, if it, like, they cannot be that dumb. They cannot all ignore it. They can't, like, how many of them are just have to keep towing the line? Because if they really digested it all and calculated it out, they would come to the same realization, and you'd have to start pulling your money out like you thought the world was going to end,
no, I
and
don't
then
think I don't
financial
think
markets would tank.
that many of them think this is what I'm telling everybody, that it's a 0.5% decrease in economic activity or funds return, based on a 3-degree warming. I don't think they think they're lying to their constituents. I think it's, hey, Nordhaus said this, he got a Nobel Prize. There's a whole bunch of other papers. In fact, like most of the papers in the economic realm, and we're financial institutions, so we care about economists, what they say, are saying, yes, it's real. It's going to have an impact. It's going to have, maybe up to a 10% impact 100 years from now or 75 years from now. And so they're not listening to Climate Chat, right? It's not like they get this other thing of information. Oh, they might hear on the news, scientists say it's bad, whatever. But they got the report. They got the report from trusted sources. They think what they assume, and they're wrong about this, they assume that the people writing those economic reports are actually paying attention to the climate science. And that's the part that's not true, right? But they just assume that, and so they think they're fine. I think, I'm sure some of them know better, but I think for the most part, they're sort of happy ignorance, I guess.
And those
It's funny.
who write the economic reports expect the modelers to look at the real world and understand the science, but they don't know that either, right? Because if all the models, if you look at the observations, the NASA satellite observations, all the models are falsified, right?
And that's the climate scientists talking about now. So even the climate scientists have optimism bias or whatever. There's normalcy bias. There's a lot of biases. Things. What was it called? Things that were the way they were before. That's the way they're going to be in the future. That we have a bias towards that. There's a lot of psychological things. I mean, the bottom line is we think of ourselves as rational, but we're anything but rational. We have biases that probably helped us survive, the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. They were very helpful to us because there's so much data around you, right? Anywhere you are. And you have to be able to focus on what's important that helps you find food and helps you stop from being eaten. And so our brains are good at that. They're good at finding patterns, and it's very helpful in that situation. But it wasn't designed to help us solve a long-term catastrophic problem like climate change. We're just, that's more than 2 weeks away. So anything that's more than 2 weeks away gets, ignored for the most part. And so that's why we're in this situation. So I do think, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize here, that we're not rational. Look at these reports. These are totally irrational reports. Yet they are the standards that the financial institutions around the world are using to basically ignore climate change. And we have to understand that, because we can understand all the climate science in the world and understand how bad, and then we can certainly talk about how climate scientists themselves are ignoring the science that Leon is pointing out about how even climate science, the results, the measured data doesn't align with their models. but their models at least are far beyond what these economist models are using. But even if you understood all the climate science perfectly, you'd still be in a world where nothing's happening. And so it's important to understand why nothing's happening, so we have at least a chance of changing it. And again, this is what this report is all about. This report is meant to, I don't want to say shame the economists and financial institutions, but it's to open their eyes that the data they're using is all wrong, and they have a fiduciary duty to find out what the right data is and to incorporate it into what they tell their customers. And so this, I think, to me, in some sense, this is a more important report than another climate science report that says there's going to be a little more warming because of some cloud feedback effect or something, which is still very important, by the way, don't get me wrong. But, we have to sort of address the irrationality of humans in order to have a chance to address this very serious problem.
Oh, sorry.
We haven't been subjected to multi-level marketing. We've been subjected to multi-level denial.
Multi-level denial, yeah.
Mhm.
Do you have any good?
Yeah, well, the one, it's like, well, it's funny, there's a denier in the chat, and so they're throwing things out, and I just chuckle because it's like, oh, these are ones I can even bat down, But the first one they put was, fun fact, California's state pension fund, CalPERS, lost 71% of a $468 million investment in its clean energy and technology fund, reducing its value to $138 million by March of 2025. And so I don't know what that is, like, to say
that's Trump.
Well, yeah, and it's also
you elect climate deniers that then try as hard as they can to hurt renewable energy when it's the most economic thing, by the way, and that kind of stuff will increase our electricity costs. Yeah.
They even renamed the National Renewable Energy Lab to the National Rocky Mountain Laboratory. We can't talk about renewable energy.
By the way, I did in China. If you just I just looked this up. If you just take the renewable energy they have already deployed, okay, this is like existing renewable energy in China, it would supply 77% of the electricity in the United States and 15% of what's called the final energy in the United States. So of total, electricity is only 20% of energy. But if you took all the energy in the United States, it would supply 15% of that. We're a wealthier nation. We could deploy even more if we wanted to. So we could easily be up to 100%. And we could really make a crack at the total energy use in the United States by switching, fossil fuel heating to other types, renewable energy heating, heat pumps, arc furnaces, and these kinds of things. And so by doing that, it just shows that we can do it. And we'd save trillions of dollars if we did it, but we're not. We're doing the opposite now. That's the point, right? That Trump's hurting renewable energy. So the fact that these things, I don't know what point he's trying to say. Ha ha ha.
Well, now they're saying it was California's investment and has nothing to do with POTUS, and that's hilarious because the way that they were getting through their initial startup phase was by investments from the federal government, and when that dries up, it is hard to get off the ground because we've been subsidizing and still continue to subsidize the fossil fuel industry at an enormous rate. If they had to go on their own, if they had to go on their own, they would collapse. It's
well, they might not collapse, but fuel price would be much higher, and therefore renewable energy would be a much more economical alternative. So just getting rid of subsidies, which, by the way, includes funding wars to protect oil supplies, which we've done throughout history, stuff like that. So, okay.
There's another
one. I do see that they're quoting climate deniers like Linsden and things like that.
Yeah. So, some comments here. Nevitt said some humans are still behaving like it's the 1600s, that the planet is infinite and is here for profit and plunder. The only thing that is infinite is ego, greed, and ignorance. And then Tom says, Rather than telling investors not to invest in fossil fuels, why not definancialize the economy instead and just take the toys away from the naughty kids? China has a different model on banking. And I think that, I mean,
Well,
I
they
think that
have,
would probably go a long way as well.
in some ways, China is the most capitalist society you've ever seen in some ways, but it's run at the top. And
It's a different discipline, though. It's not. It's for the.
yeah, there's
It's
a
for
very,
the
very
people
much
and the
government
state.
controlled
Then,
economy.
yeah,
But-
than individual, financial instruments and all these things we created that make people money and brought out a lot of other things.
And that's what someone's asking here. What do I think about that? Well, look, I think that we need government that takes climate change seriously. And I'm not just talking about Trump. I'm talking about Biden and Obama both talked a good climate game. But when it came to actual policy, they did some good stuff, for climate policy. But then again, they also oversaw the greatest increase in fossil fuel extraction in history and made the U.S. the number
Proudly.
one fossil fuel country again.
Yeah.
And they were proud of that. That was not a mistake. It didn't happen by accident. It was part of the plan. And if you have a plan to actually address climate change, it does not include increasing fossil fuels. As quote that I made up, what I like is that it comes as a surprise to many, but it turns out that you cannot reduce fossil fuel emissions by increasing them. And that's what they were trying to do. And so, yeah, we need leadership. There's many different mechanisms once you have the right leadership, but we need leadership that actually takes climate change very seriously and is willing to take the steps necessary. Now, the good news is there's lots of steps we could do that will help the economy. Of course, you can shut down the economy, which seems to be Trump's plan, but we could increase, we could still grow the economy through renewables. It saves money, it lowers costs of energy and these kinds of things. That has some negative side effects for climate, by the way, when you do that. But overall, it should help because we need to decouple energy from fossil fuels, right? So everyone says that energy is bad. Well, it's not energy that's bad. It's the emissions that come from energy, and we can decouple that. Okay.
Did you want to answer his question at 10:31?
10:31. Let me go back.
Dan, what do you think about the Chinese national banking model? Is it an alternative to excessive financialization we see in the West? Could we do climate impact mitigation with more statism?
Well, there's a lot of things I think we could do, and the best form of government is a benevolent dictatorship, right? They don't necessarily have that in China, by the way. There are a lot of people not happy with the government there. But one thing you can do is control the economy and the banking. And so I think, let's put it this way, putting the banking system aside, they also say you want to get a fossil fuel car. Okay, the registration is very limited in the big cities, and you got to pay, I think, literally $10,000 to register the car. And if you want an EV, you can get that registration in a month, and it costs you like a little bit of money. So there's EVs everywhere, and they're really good, and there's a lot of charging infrastructure and that kind of thing. So I think that government directing good things and suppressing bad things that are bad for everyone might be good individually. Someone really likes their gas-powered Hummer or something like that, but that's really bad for society in many ways. And so I think that approach, where we incentivize the good things and we disincentivize the bad things, is a start, And then also, of course, we need more renewable energy, so we need more grid capacity. That's sort of at the government level. We need to make sure there's enough grid capacity. There's so many solar projects that would come online tomorrow if they could connect to the grid, and they can't. So there's these delays that China just takes care of. I mean, they just do it, right? So we could do it too, We just have a screwed up system that is meant to sort of stop it. And now, of course, Trump, on top of all of it, is trying to stop even the economical renewables that want to come on the grid, or wind, for example, and claiming weird things about whales and whatever. It's just not true. So,
Like he gives a about whales. I mean, come on.
so let's see let's see. Looking through the comments here. Did you see any others there that we should maybe cover?
No, I think that was about it. Somebody asked, mentioned donut economics as if that might have.
Here's one. Here's a funny one. There's only been 8 inches of global sea level rise since 1880, according to NOAA and NASA. Don't worry, we're not going underwater. That's an interesting logic. Yeah. We're not underwater yet, so we can't ever be underwater. Really?
No.
Is that how it works?
Well, they also had one. I don't know if you can get back to it at 10:29. They were working in Napa that night, making the leap of the climate causing the fire is delusional. And it's like, it didn't light the fire, but it sure made it propel.
Right, and then they also argue that, hey, the number of fires hasn't gone up. Okay, but the area
The
burned by the
severity.
fires has gone up like some crazy amount.
Mhm.
Just I think there was more area burned in the last 5 years in California, way more than the last 100 altogether.
Mhm.
And the reason is very simple. The climate disruption does not cause ignitions, right? It builds up the fuel. It makes the wind blow sometimes a lot harder, like it did in Palisades. And the criticism here has been that no, they weren't prepared. They didn't have enough water from Northern California. 100-mile-an-hour winds. You could have had that. You could have had 4 times as many firefighters. It would have been the same story.
You could have been drawing from the ocean. It's
Yeah,
not going to
exactly.
make a difference. Which
Yeah,
it was right
here's-
there. I mean,
This is a long one, but it basically says that we're talking essentially why. Well, first of all, we don't really have a price on carbon, but if we did have a real price on carbon that reflected the true risk, it would be very high indeed. In fact, one of my first climate chats, it was actually on Clubhouse, but I did convert it to YouTube so you can listen to it. It's with David Archer, and it's about the ultimate cost of carbon. And what would the cost of carbon be if we didn't have a discount rate and make future damage be very tiny, right? And he came up with $27,000 per ton of CO2. And that's because, and this is really an eye-opening interview for me as well, because some of the, we talk about how CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years, right? Some of it lasts for 500,000 years. So when you burn your gallon of gasoline today to take your trip, the damage from that will go for about 500, some of it, not all of it, but 500,000 years. And I don't know if it was during the interview or maybe afterwards, we talked about that 1 gallon that you burned over its lifetime in the atmosphere will cause heating equivalent to a Hiroshima atomic bomb. 1 gallon of gasoline, which creates how much CO2? I forget how much CO2 that is. 16 pounds, or I'm not sure. But since it causes heating right now, but it continues heating the Earth a little bit for 500,000 years. And that cumulative energy, not all at once, though it's not the same thing as a bomb going off, but just the heat equivalent of that. So it just kind of boggles your mind, and then you understand why we're in trouble, right? Because you can think about your own personal emissions and how. Another one, by the way, which I read long ago, which is, excuse me for probably screwing up everybody's morning routine now, but if you you know, when you use a hair dryer to dry your hair in the morning, now let's say you're doing it for 1 minute, right? You do it for 1 minute, and you know that's using electricity. It's 1,500 watts, 1,800 watts, and that if it's supplied by a fossil fuel power plant, you know, emits a little bit of CO2.
That's what I
Right? But
was
not
just
very much.
going
It's
to.
only for a minute, right? So it can't be very much. Well, if you took that CO2 and you looked at its cumulative warming over the next 500,000 years and compressed it down to 1 minute, because you're using it for 1 minute, that would be the heat equivalent of a fully loaded 747 at full takeoff power. The 4 engines from a 747 at full takeoff power. So when you're going like this, just imagine outside a 747 at full takeoff power, and
So-
fortunately for Leon, he doesn't have a lot of hair, so he doesn't run into this problem, I think.
I was just going to ask you that because I knew you gave that example a lot, and so the question I wanted to ask was, because I think that's the first time I've heard you say, if you're getting your electricity from fossil fuels, which most of ours in California is not. Not to mention the fact that I rarely use a hairdryer. Rarely, I let it air dry and do other stuff. Anyway, if I have
But
solar
that's really,
power,
by the way, that's just the example. There's probably a lot of other things you're doing in your
well,
life.
yeah. But if I have solar power, I can do all of it.
Yeah,
and not.
but in California, I think it's around 50% maybe renewables, or I mean, it's really good compared to the rest of the country, but even so, it's only 2 engines on the 747, you know, instead of all
But
4.
no, I mean, if I personally have solar power on my home,
If you have solar power in your home, that's true, except of course it took fossil fuels to make the solar panel, and there's embedded carbon in every device in your home. So
there's
Yeah,
embedded carbon in every power plant that we have. as well. So
after 3 years or sooner, you get past that. So
yeah.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Well, no, it never goes away. It's just that the energy you generated is more than the embedded energy. That's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
So it's
You've
no
paid it
worth
back.
anymore. So, all right. Anyway, by the way, it's been an hour. I think the presentation was only 25 minutes. So we should probably call it quits now. We had some good, we can, however, if folks out there have further comments, please put them in the comments for the recorded video and we can interact there. It also helps the algorithm if you put comments in the video, because YouTube sees that and sees there's engagement, and then they show this video to more and more people. And so that helps as well. So please like and subscribe and do that. And any last comments, Leon or Stacy or Eli? Or we sign off?
Just making it an official cat video. That's all.
There we go. Kind of
I think it does bear mentioning right now, since much of the United States is experiencing extreme cold, that anybody who runs across the climate deniers and stooges, say, mocking global warming, it's the simple correction is it's climate disruption, and what we are seeing now is precisely due to Arctic warming or Arctic amplification. And the more people who understand that this is a real world impact right now that is directly tied to climate disruption, the better chances we have of moving the needle.
Yeah, and just to respond one more to this climate denier there in the audience who says that CO2 temperature precedes CO2 changes, which is true, by the way. But CO2 also precedes temperature changes. They work to reinforce each other. Just so you know out there, just seeing these really old debunked climate myths out there in the audience. The climate denial community has not updated itself at all. It's really kind of sad to see these old things. Anyway.
Yeah. And indeed, the weather still happens. The Earth axis is still tilted, so we still have northern hemisphere winter in January, and there's still weather, so there's still some variability. So some days are colder than others. So big surprise. And yeah, my kids already know the difference between climate and weather, and I'd hope some climate deniers would start to learn that as well.
Yeah. Very good. Well, everyone, thanks for joining the show. And again, like and subscribe. We'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.